We're joined now by Dr. Michael Dorsey, a well-respected expert on global environmental issues who is with the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. Dr. Dorsey, good to have you with us. So the new standards would require a 30% cut in carbon emissions by power plants by the year 2030. As far as you're concerned, does that go far enough?
Angela, this is a monumental step for the Environmental Protection Agency. It's a monumental step led by the White House and our president. It's a step that begins to move us on a path of avoiding dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. But unfortunately, it doesn't go far enough. History will look back on this and worry that the president didn't do enough in the critical moment when he had the opportunity to really put not just the United States on a path of getting out ahead of the unfolding climate crisis, but really lead the world on tackling this unfolding crisis.
So what should the president have done?
Well, you have to understand that this plan is really about moving the goalpost around. The president sets his plan in cooperation with the EPA at a benchmark of 2005, where the world really is focused on a benchmark of 1990. That difference in about 15 years really means that the overall reduction of emissions that the United States will commit by moving this plan forward will really be much, much less than what's needed. Some estimates say we need to double our commitments. Some say we need to triple it to really, really seriously begin to tackle the unfolding climate crisis that the planet is facing that's really undermining municipalities and states in our country.
And Dr. Dorsey, tell me, where does the 1990, where does that year come from?
Well, that's really the international baseline that was negotiated almost 2 decades ago at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. It's also enshrined in the Kyoto Protocol negotiations, which came forth a little bit later in 1997. So that's really the international standard to be associated with. It's really important that the president did direct the Environmental Protection Agency to move in the direction that it's moving, and it's a good thing for the country, it's a good thing for business, it's a good thing for the environment, but much, much more needs to be done, especially if we're going to protect marginalized communities, low-income communities, African-American communities that are harmed first and most by the unfolding climate crisis. We saw that in New York with a very mild Hurricane Sandy. We saw that with catastrophic effect in New Orleans with the cataclysmic Katrina.
And explain to me for a second, because I want to get back to the minority issue in just a second, but is the international community going to be disappointed with us because we aren't really holding up our end of the bargain? If the Kyoto Protocol calls for, 5.2% change by a certain year, and we've moved the goalpost now to a 2005 baseline as opposed to the 1990, how is this going to impact our relationship globally?
Well, I think the world leaders are thankful that the president led the Environmental Protection Agency to make this first move. Much, much more is needed and necessary, and world leaders are expecting much, much more. Right now, the United States is about to move into chairing the Arctic Council. Some see this as one of the few multilateral spaces where things are getting done and being done. And it's a critical space in part because we know that going forward, one of the places where we can really, really sort of move leaps and bounds is stopping what we call short-term forces in the global north and reducing things like methane emissions that are coming from the melting ice flows in the global north. So the world community is expecting much, much more, but I think at the same time we've seen the signals, particularly from those in the United Nations, particularly from those associated with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that they're applauding this initial move, and much, much more needs to be done, particularly in 2 years at the Paris climate talks, where the world's countries will recommit themselves to do much, much more on this problem. So this is a first important move, but we hope to see much, much more coming from the White House to get us on course of where we need to be to really seriously get out ahead of this unfolding problem.
Dr. Dorsey, I'm going to quote President Obama here, if we can put the quote up on the screen there. He said, and I'm quoting him, "We limit the amount of toxic chemicals like mercury, sulfur, and arsenic that power plants put in our air and water, but they can dump unlimited amounts of carbon pollution into the air. It's not smart, it's not safe, and it doesn't make sense." That coming from President Obama a couple of days ago. The administration finally getting around to the power plant issue, because in 2009, of course, they dealt with emissions from cars and trucks. But this is the big chunk, the power plants.
Well, and it's great you put that quotation from the president up there. I mean, the real thing is that this is a triple win for the United States. This is a win for public health, it's a win for the economy, it's a win for the environment. The reality is that power plants don't just emit CO2 or carbon dioxide, which drives the climate change problem. They also emit a whole host of other pollutants like the president named, arsenic, heavy metals, and so forth. And when we reduce overall emissions, we reduce those emissions from those other co-contaminants as well. So those basically generate and produce upsides for public health. They reduce overall asthma rates, they reduce overall deaths from asthma, and we know that African Americans in particular are harmed more so from asthma deaths than their white counterparts. And so this is an overall public health victory. It's a victory for the economy. We get more efficient production from those power plants. We see many of the coal-fired power plants being come offline and making space for the new 21st century green technologies, wind and solar in particular. We also see overall net benefits for the environment, not just a reduction of those co-pollutants that you mentioned and the president mentioned, but also the overall reduction of carbon dioxide, which drives the climate problem. So it's a triple win and definitely something to build on, something that Americans can be proud of, but also something that Americans need to continue to pressure the White House to do more on and to deliver bigger and better and more inspirationally and aspirationally on.
Dr. Dorsey, are a lot of these power plants located in communities where low-income people live?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, one of the problems that we see is that in the United States environmental policy is really overburdened by the problem of environmental racism. And that means that we have a disproportionately concentrated share of polluting industries in low-income and minority communities. And that's a problem that a great number of researchers, some of my colleagues, Dr. Bob Bullard, Dr. Bunyan Bryant, and others have been studying for over the past couple decades and looking at the distribution and geographic sort of positioning of these toxic facilities, some of them emitting a lot of CO2, but others also emitting a whole host of other types of pollutants. So indeed, industries are concentrated in low and poor and minority communities in this country. And it's a problem that the current EPA has recognized. The current EPA has made an explicit commitment to push a program of environmental justice to tackle the disproportionate siting and locating of toxic and hazardous facilities in low-income and communities of color.
And the new standards also allow states to have some flexibility as to how they actually enact this.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that this plan does, the EPA has made it really clear that what they ultimately want to do is reduce emissions. They want to reduce both CO2, which drives the unfolding climate crisis. They also want to reduce all the other associated co-pollutants that you mentioned before. But they are allowing states to enact policies and reinforce and reinvigorate policies that they already have on the books, as well as roll out new policies. And that really provides an opportunity for not just a silver bullet coming out of Washington and dictating how this problem can be tackled, but it really is an opportunity to really sort of do what a colleague says is shoot out the silver buckshot to get a variety of solutions checking this problem. And that's actually a good thing.
And Dr. Dorsey, finally, the critics are saying that, that these new EPA standards are going to cost jobs, that these new EPA standards are going to cause our electric bills to be higher. Is there any truth to this?
Well, let's be clear. These standards, again, they're a triple win for the economy, for the environment, and for public health. There are no jobs on a dead planet, Angela. The fact is that when we clean up the environment, and we protect workers and we protect families and we protect children, that drives the economy. Those things, the maneuvers to reduce emissions, to check co-pollutants, those things drive not just reducing emissions on the planet and in this country, but they also protect children, they protect economies, they protect mothers, fathers, families, they save the environment and drive the economy. So nothing else could be a better path to be on than this one, but much, much more needs to be done to really get out ahead of this unfolding crisis.
Dr. Michael Dorsey with the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, it was a joy having you on. Next time, we're going to have you here in the studio with me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.